Hello. Hello. Good afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome to Pastor's Bible Study, Fall Edition. It's good to see some familiar faces back here, a few new friends, and so we're grateful for each of you for being here today. We've got a few things going on. We've had several birthdays in our midst. Brian, you might have to help remind me. One, our beloved D-Dub, Dr. Wiles, and our chef, Warren, both had birthdays yesterday. And so happy birthday to them yesterday. Happy birthday. And then today, this very day, Bob Anderson, who greets for us at the Center Street doors and may still be greeting. So Bob, who let you in, it's his birthday today. And then I've already forgotten. It's Rhonda Sanders, of course. I bought her lunch, and I already forgot. It's Rhonda's birthday as well. And so I don't know if we need... Michael, you're here. Do we sing? Does it feel like we should sing? Why don't you lead us so I don't have to from the mic? Lead us in a quick little happy birthday. Why don't you? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, everybody. Thank you. Happy birthday to y'all. Thank you. Well, we are grateful for each of you, and happy birthday to everybody in our midst. Thank you, thank you. We are walking through Exodus again. We're picking up where we left off, and we've got our very own Dr. Wiles back teaching us, so we're excited for that, and I'm excited to see each of you and to walk through this together as we try to study the Bible, be faithful studiers of the Word and doers of the Word, and we're just excited to be back together. And so with that, if you would allow me, let's just pause together, ask God to bless our time, and then we'll invite Dr. Wiles up. So let's pray together. Lord Jesus, we're grateful to be gathered together around the table, grateful to the kitchen for serving this food. And Lord, I ask as we study your word, as we gather around your scripture, that you would help illuminate these truths for us, that you would help us to walk in your ways and help us to be more faithful disciples of Jesus, even today. And so, Lord, we give this entire time to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. We have Dr. Wiles up here in just a minute.
Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. How are y'all? Okay, so years ago, I don't know if y'all remember Roy Clark, who used to be on Hee Haw. You know what I'm talking about? Very talented musician, could play just about every instrument. And so my mom and dad love Roy Clark, and so I was with them one night, and we were watching him in concert on television, and he was playing the guitar. And if y'all remember, he was just an incredibly gifted musician. Well, somewhere in the performance, there was a pause in the music, and he just stopped. And he put the guitar down and set it over on a little stand. He picked the banjo up, and he played the banjo for a long time. He put that down, he picked up the mandolin, and he played the mandolin for a long time. He put that down and picked up a harmonica and played the harmonica. He put that down and went over and sat down at the piano and played the piano for a while. Anyway, after multiple instruments, he came back and sat down and he picked the guitar up, and he said, "I bet y'all thought I forgot where I was." And then he just picked right back up. That's how I feel today. I bet y'all forgot. Y'all think I have forgotten where I am in this Bible study, but I have not forgotten. We're on page 20 of Exodus, okay? That's where we are. And so we're going to look today at the 10 words, as they're called in Exodus. If you'll look at your outline, I just wanted to remind you of where we've already been. The first 19 chapters, 19 pages of Exodus is actually the story of the Exodus, where Israel's delivered from Egypt, and then God commissions his people in Exodus 19. And Exodus 20, where we're going to be today, marks the beginning of the covenant that God's going to create for Israel. And that covenant explanation is not going to end until we get to the 27th chapter of Leviticus. So it's going to take us a while to get this, what typically is referred to as the book of the covenant. It's going to take us a while to get done with that because it goes all the way through the next book. We're not going to go all the way through Leviticus. What we're going to do is we're going to study Exodus, and it will take us through most of this year. And then in 2025, we're going to start with the study of Matthew just to get you ready, okay? But we're going to finish Exodus before we do that. So, in Exodus 19, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai and will be there for about a year, give or take, before they'll move on, okay? So here's what God is going to provide for his people, okay? Think about it. They have been living in bondage in Egypt, and 400 years or so, they've grown into a nation, but they've not really had any level of independence. They've been slaves, and they had obviously some type of organization, because when Moses went to meet with them, if you remember, Moses and Aaron, they met with the elders of Israel. So there was some kind of organizational structure for them. We're not really sure how they managed their worship practices. We're not sure how all that worked. I would just say this, there's a lot of unknown to them right now. They are now out, delivered from Egypt. They're out in the wilderness at the foot of this mountain range and unsure of their future. More than likely, most of them probably thought, here in a few weeks, we're going to be at our final destination. God's getting ready to take us to this land that he has promised us, that he gave to Abraham, and it's only about a 3 to 4 week journey to get there, so more than likely that's kind of in their psyche. They have no idea what's ahead of them. So, for example, God is going to leave them at Mount Sinai for a year. He's going to instruct them, he's going to teach them, and he's going to give them his expectations of them, and he's going to create a new people, if you will. So, as you read the Old Testament, here's what you'll discover. It's filled with legislation. So I've put here in the outline, there's Jewish scholars typically say in their Bible, there are 613 laws, okay? Now, the law in the Old Testament is paradigmatic in nature, not exhaustive in nature. We'll talk about that in just a second. But when you look at the law that Israel would ultimately receive from God, there are going to be two foundational laws. Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, with all your strength. Leviticus 19, verse 18, love your neighbor as yourself. Now you'll remember, Jesus will be asked about that many, many years later. Right now, if you take the traditional date of the Exodus, we're about 1,450 years before Christ when we're at Mount Sinai. So take us back 2,000 years at the time of Jesus. Let's go back another 1,450 years or so, and that's where we are at this moment. But eventually, the Jews are going to recognize, as God reveals himself to them, that there are two foundational laws. Jesus will be asked about that, and he'll call to mind both of them. But then there are what we typically refer to as the Ten Commandments, but in this text, they're called words. 10 words. And so we have those. They will give expression to these two foundational laws. So depending on how you number the 10 commandments, and it's quite interesting, our Jewish brothers and sisters number the commandments differently than we do. There's still 10 of them. They count them differently than we do. Our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters do that as well. The NIV is heavily influenced by Protestant theology and leans toward Protestants. So if you have your copy of the Bible with you today and you happen to have an NIV, you'll see the way it's actually printed on the page. The 10 Commandments are highlighted by the way they're printed, by how Protestants have typically counted the 10 Commandments. Okay? So for example, the Jews would argue that the very first verse 2 is the first commandment. Protestants don't count that as a commandment. It is a statement of an introduction. Context. But if you look at these commands, the way they're laid out, the first 4 of them are connected to the command to love God, and the final 6 are connected to the command to love your neighbor. And then after that, there's going to be 601 more commands in the Old Testament. Now, scholars typically, they use all kind of words to describe the legislation in the Old Testament. I won't go into all of those, but I will just mention 2 of them, paradigmatic and exhaustive. You and I are modern Westerners, and so we typically view legislation as being exhaustive. And what I mean by that is our legal codes in most every city, county, or state are thousands of pages long. And why is that? Because we're exhaustive in nature, and it's exhausting to try to keep up with it. The Jews chose not to do that. They wrote paradigm law. That's why it's called paradigmatic. So, for example, if you read in Exodus 22 that you can't take your neighbor's sheep or donkey, and you say to the judge when you're brought in, well, I didn't, I took his goat. That's a loophole, right? But in the Jewish law, they used common sense to extrapolate the law to cover other circumstances rather than actually writing it out. We've chosen to write it all out. That's why there are so many loopholes. That's why y'all get frustrated when somebody gets caught doing something that you know is guilty and they're actually a criminal and they get off because of some technicality, right? It's very frustrating to us because it feels unjust. But that's because we have an exhaustive approach to legislation. The Jews did not do that. In other words, if the command is don't bear false witness against your neighbor, well, that means you also can't lie about your mama, even though she wouldn't be considered a neighbor. In other words, they will take the paradigm, if you will, extrapolate it to cover with common sense what seemed right to them. Does that make sense? That's why it's called paradigmatic law. That's why the Old Testament doesn't have 10,000 laws in it, because they chose not to cover every single situation that was going to take place. You know, like you were told you could not attack and do harm to your parents. Well, you could say, well, I actually was attacking my grandmother. Well, okay, an exhaustive law would be a loophole, but the paradigmatic law, you would still be guilty. So there's a whole system of judges that will be set up across Israel to manage the paradigmatic laws. And it's interesting to me, the way Jews are viewed sometimes, we view them as, particularly in the New Testament, as being very legalistic. You know what I mean? We usually view them negatively that way, when actually they were, but they also used a whole lot of common sense in the application of their legislation. And Just want to make sure y'all notice that and that they get credit for that, okay? Now, with that said, Alan Cole has written a wonderful little commentary on Exodus. It's just it's in the old Tyndale Old Testament commentary series. It's a small volume, but it's really insightful. And he says this: it has been said that 10 Commandments are God's nature expressed in terms of moral imperatives, and it's significant that God chose to reveal himself so rather than in terms of philosophical propositions. In other words, God reveals his nature not in just declaring these esoteric, speculative, philosophical statements, but instead, he uses moral imperatives. These are the things that are going to express my character. These are the things that will express my very nature. God is a moral God. And so therefore his expectations are framed as moral imperatives. So with that said, let's look at the text. Let's look at Exodus 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, 10 words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So God is revealing himself as the God of history. What he's about to say is going to make Israel understand he's the God of everyday life. His expectations are going to govern their everyday behavior. He's not just one who's acted in history, he is that. But these 10 words express the divine nature, who God is, what God has done. They're not abstract laws. The 10 Commandments are not just abstract statements that will help you just be a good citizen if you'll abide by them. That's not the intent of the 10 Commandments. Now, if you choose to abide by the 10 Commandments, will you be a good citizen? Yes. But that's not the reason God gave them. God gave these moral imperatives to a redeemed people, to people that He Himself has rescued. And here's what He's going to do. He's going to reorder society for them based around these fundamental imperatives. In fact, there are some theologians who argue that what God is doing is imposing a cosmic order in the social sphere. In other words, some theologians say, if you want to know how to do God's will on earth as it is in heaven, listen to these commands. Listen to these 10 words. This is what God is going to expect from His people. Reveals what God is like. In fact, Peter Enns, who's written another wonderful commentary on Exodus, he says he views the 10 Commandments as an act of recreation. That God has created everything that is, and now He's recreating these new people to live the way He wants them to live in the midst of the world in which God has called them. So that's kind of a general introduction to 10 Commandments. You know, 10 Commandments are somewhat controversial in our culture. It's fascinating to me. People get angry over where to put them. You know, can you hang the 10 Commandments in a classroom at a school? They're displayed at the Supreme Court, and people like to argue all of that. And I would just tell you, historically, I don't have a whole lot of energy for that. I'm more interested in not where the 10 Commandments are hanging. I'm more interested in whether or not they're inside of us, because I feel like if we were living them out well, I wouldn't have to hang them up anywhere. That would be my take on it, and I'm saying that respectfully. Because this is God's desire for His people. And we can take these and extrapolate them out in how we live every day. And that is the message to me. That's the incarnational approach to this. I'm an incarnational theologian. That's how I view the world. It's the lens through which I typically focus my theological perspective. I just believe God's created us to live incarnationally. He gave us the finest example of that in His Son. And so I just believe it's supposed to be embodied inside of us. Okay? So with that said, let's talk about the 10 words, all right? So look at verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. What an interesting way to say it. Why didn't He just say there are no other gods? It's a fascinating way to put it. You can have no other gods before me. Well, in the ancient world, pagan people believed in all kinds of gods. And what's fascinating is scholars disagree on how to translate this, because when you see that word gods in the plural, that's actually, sometimes that's referred to as the plural majesty, that you speak about gods in the plural, if that makes sense. We do that about Yahweh in the Old Testament. So it could just say, you have no other God before me. That would be a legitimate translation of it from Hebrew. But the NIV translators have chosen to say, you shall have no other gods before me. But the word before is also an interesting word, because you could translate that word besides me. Okay, so either one of those is an appropriate way. It's just a contextual matter that we're not really sure the best way to translate it. But here's what God is basically saying. God understood where Israel was living, the time in which they lived. And Israel lived at a time when it was very common for people to have numerous gods. They would have a national god that they felt like best represented who they were as a people. They would have a family god that was passed generationally from one generation to the next. They would have a personal god that was probably their favorite, depending upon where they lived and what it is they thought they needed. So it was very common for ancient people to have that approach to understanding deity. Basically, what God is saying in that context is, I am the only God there is. You will not have any of this before me. Now, you'll remember that there are going to be times when things happen, like back in Genesis. Y'all remember when Rachel and Leah ended up getting delivered to Jacob? They had to destroy all the family gods. Y'all remember that story that we've already read? That's because they took these little idols with them wherever they went. If you fast forward to the New Testament, it's still going to be practiced in the New Testament. By the time you get to the New Testament, people actually had them in their homes. And they would have little shelves built for them. And one of the challenges that Paul addresses in the letter to, this is an aside, by the way, but one of the challenges that Paul addresses in his letter to the Corinthians is a married couple where one of the members of the couple becomes a Christian and the other one stays a pagan. And the question is, how do y'all live together in the same house? Because Paul knew full well that pagans would have little idols all over the house, little gods, if you will. And so what if the wife becomes a Christian and she says, we're not going to light incense anymore to these gods. In fact, I'm going to take them off the shelf. And the husband says, that's my grandfather's God. We're going to leave it where it stays. Those were real issues. And it's all rooted in this incredibly historic pagan approach to deity. There were so many gods in the ancient world. And so God begins the 10 words by saying, I'm the only one there is. You'll have none of this before me. Then he says, there are to be no idols. Look at verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous, we would probably say zealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. It's a very lengthy explanation of what they're not to do. This is going to be the greatest temptation that the people of God will face, because idolatry was universal, commonplace. It was just assumed in the ancient world. Show me your God. Every culture could do that. Yahweh was not going to tolerate any form of idolatry. In other words, God, who created the heavens and the earth, is the owner of his image. And he will not allow anybody else to have copyright to it. And so instead of allowing human beings to somehow put his image on display, he's actually put his image in us. And so the image of God is already there, and it's in human beings. And so you're not to craft anything that you would somehow believe is now a God incarnate, if you will, even though that was very normal in the ancient world. And sometimes we look at it and think it was silly, because you'd say, well, it's silly because they would craft a God out of wood they made with their own hands and then bow down to it. Well, what you don't realize is, or haven't thought about this, they didn't just do that. Whenever they crafted an idol, there was a process of incantation where they believed that idol was then actually the beneficiary of the presence of the God that they called forth. And so it wasn't just a wooden idol or something made out of some other substitute material, whatever it might have been. That wasn't the point. The point was the priest had performed the incantation, and it now was that God present. And so it was just a normal thing. So what God is saying is, I'm the creator, and so you as a creature can't come up with anything like me. So I'm not going to allow you to do that. But it was such a temptation, and it will be for the Jews, because the Jews could argue, well, we have our national God, Yahweh, but these are our personal gods, because that was already in place in the ancient world. And so God is going to rule all of that out in these 10 words. In fact, the reason it was such a temptation, there are numerous scholars who've done a lot of research in idolatry in the ancient world. And what some scholars say is, Douglas Stewart has written a commentary on Exodus. He talks about how the idols engaged, the people engaged with the idols in a contractual, transactional relationship. And here's what's kind of interesting. You may never have thought about it this way, but this is how they were taught. These gods could do everything except feed themselves. So what you have to do is feed the gods. So you bring your sacrifice to the temple, wherever it's set up, or the altar, wherever they set up the altars. And then you bring this and you offer this up, and it is food to the gods when the blood is poured out for them. And so there was this transactional relationship that if you kept your end of the bargain and you fed the god, well, then that god was obligated to answer whatever it was you needed. So it was their expectation that the gods and goddesses would respond to them every time they fed them. It was just commonplace. It was convenient. It was very selfish because the gods existed really just to placate the needs of the people. And so you had God for everything, multiple gods. And the worship of those gods was very indulgent. It was corrupt. It was characterized by all kinds of practices. And so they did all kinds of things to try to motivate their gods to do things for them. Do y'all remember when Elijah was on Mount Carmel? You remember that story? And the prophets of Baal are dancing around trying to get Baal's attention. And Elijah keeps poking fun at him. Well, maybe he's busy. Maybe he's gone out for a break. Maybe he's resting. Well, what they were doing was they were engaging in all kinds of practices, somehow trying to stimulate Baal to answer them. And so, but that was very common in the ancient world. That's just what they did, the priests and the people. And so what God says in response to that is, I'm a jealous, zealous God, and I'm not going to tolerate it. As a matter of fact, he says, if you choose to do it, your children will do it, and their children will do it. And so when he says, I'm going to punish the third and fourth generations, that was kind of a way for the Jews to say, there are going to be some natural outcomes. If you choose to live in rebellion against me, it's going to have a generational effect. There are just going to be things that are going to happen because of this disobedience and this hatred that you've displayed for me. The opposite of that is, if you love me, well, there will be blessings that will take place generationally because there will be things that you'll pass down to your children and your grandchildren. And so God was saying, I'm connecting this to the future of your family and your people. Okay? Then the next one, verse 7, honor the Lord's name. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. We typically refer to that as taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, you know what's fascinating? If you fast forward in time, do you know there will come a time when Israel will not even pronounce the Lord's name anymore. They will not pronounce Yahweh. They won't write it down on a scroll. They're very careful about it, and only the priest, the high priest, can actually utter the name Yahweh, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. That's how special God's name was. Because God's name signified his very essence. And his name stood for everything that was holy. And so you weren't to swear by him and then engage in some kind of unholy activity or misrepresent the truth. You've heard people say, well, I'll swear on my mother's life. You know what I mean by that? That kind of a statement? Well, in the ancient world, it's very common to swear on the names of the gods. And God is cautioning Israel, be careful swearing on my name. You don't take my name in vain, because God's name represented his very essence and who he was. Remember what his name meant. I am. So if you misuse my name, you're actually attacking the very nature of who I am as I've revealed myself to you. So he says you can't do that. And then verse 8, keep the Sabbath. This is the lengthiest one in the commandments. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now that's interesting. There's a connection between God saying refrain from work and keep this holy. Okay? So kind of a combination there, if you will. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day it's the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Now, that's one of the most exhaustive statements in the Ten Commandments. That's more than paradigmatic. In other words, the Jew could have said, well, I'm not working on the Sabbath, but my servant is out there bringing in the harvest. So God is saying, no, you can't even do that. Don't go send your son out in the field. Don't send your daughter out in the field. Don't send any of your servants. Don't force your animals to work that day. He says, as a matter of fact, even the aliens who live among you, don't force them to work that day. Because the Jews could have said that, well, you know, this commandment's just for the Jews. So these guys who are living with us are our slaves. They're not Jews, so they can work today. God will say, no, nobody can work on this day. He says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So basically what God is placing in place in the life of Israel is a rhythm, if you will, a rhythm for life. And that rhythm already exists in creation. God has put it there. Every single day there's a sunrise and a sunset. He's built a rhythm into his creation. The earth is going to rotate accordingly. The earth is going to revolve accordingly. So there are going to be seasons. In fact, the scripture says in Genesis, as long as there's a world, there's going to be seasons. There's going to be a time to plant. There's going to be a time to harvest. And so God has built rhythm into his creation. He's placed rhythm in us. You know, you in your body, there's things that you do and you work all day, and all of a sudden at nighttime you have to rest. You've got to go to sleep. Your body requires it. Y'all have probably seen these studies that have done of people who never sleep. As a matter of fact, it becomes a threat to your very life. Your body rebuilds, it recalibrates, it restores. We have to have rest. So God puts rhythm in place. Well, then he says, now, there's a weekly rhythm for you. One of these days belongs to me. Give it to me. And basically what you're saying is you're trusting God to take care of you. You're trusting God to provide for you. And so if you fast forward to today, you and I as believers, very early on, the early church, and they were predominantly Jewish, they moved their holy day from Friday to Sunday, marking the resurrection of Jesus. And so Friday evening at sundown no longer became that Sabbath day for them. Does that make sense? Starts on Friday night at sundown. You probably could call it Saturday, but it starts on Friday night. Well, the early Christians said, no, actually, under the new covenant, the first day of the week is the day that we believe belongs to the Lord. It's a principle applied for the very same thing, but now for even a deeper reason. Not just honoring what God has done for us with this command to rest, but also honoring the resurrection of Jesus and the salvation of our souls. But in agrarian society, this was hard to do because a farmer can work every day, right? There's not a farmer worth his or her salt who wakes up in the morning wondering if there's anything to do today. There is something to do today. There's something that needs to be fixed. There are tools that need to be repaired. There's stuff in the field that needs to be attended to. There are weeds that need to be pulled up, chemicals that need to be laid down. I mean, in an agrarian society, every single day is a work day. But God said, I'll tell you what, here's really what the Sabbath became for the Jews. It became the public sign of the covenant, because nobody else did this. Now, they were going to have a private sign of the covenant, right? Circumcision. That's a private sign of the covenant. Public sign of the covenant is going to be the Sabbath. Keep this day. And so that meant that Jews, wherever they lived, Friday night at sundown, everything ends. And you got pagans who get up on Saturday and they're going about their daily business, not the Jews. You know, when Cindy and I went to Israel, we landed on a Friday evening, and we were hungry, and we were staying with some friends who were missionaries there, and we were talking about going to get something to eat, and he said, well, we'll have to go to the West Bank because we can't eat in the Jewish area. And I wasn't even thinking, and I said, really? And he said, it's the Sabbath, Dennis. I said, oh yeah, I've read about that. And guess what? All the Jewish restaurants were closed. It's Friday night. All the Palestinian restaurants were open. And so we were able to go and eat. Even though they have a holy day as well, there was still that sense in which for the Jews, there's something about this day. The sense of that's been carried over to the Sunday for us. And again, it's a sign of trust in God. Then the next one, honor your parents. Verse 12, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land and the Lord your God has given you. Well, there's the shift now. We're moving from our relationship with God. That's the first few commandments. Now we're moving to our neighbor, our relationships with people, if you will. So the two foundational core commandments, love the Lord your God, well, those are the first four. And now love your neighbor. These are the next six. And so we will honor our father and mother. Family relationships are at the very foundation of the people of God. And particularly this one, God says, if you will care for your parents and treat them accordingly, You will be healthy people. God will continue to provide for you. You'll be able to live in this promised land, and you'll build a healthy society. If you live in rebellion against your parents and you don't honor this core family relationship, then there's going to be trouble in the land. Then, he says in verse 13, no murder. It's really just two words in Hebrew, no murder. And it's typically translated because of the intensity of it, thou shalt not murder. In the NIV, it says, you shall not murder. One of the decisions that the NIV translators made a long time ago was to use that word you. But the reason that some translations still use the word thou and thee is that's your sign that it's a singular pronoun, if that makes sense. That's the key in an English translation. If you see thou or thee, that's a singular pronoun. If you see you or yours, that's a plural pronoun. The NIV doesn't do that. So we lose that distinction with the NIV. But in other words, all of these commandments are in the first person singular or second person singular. They're for you, in other words. So they're all masculine and singular. But again, remember the paradigmatic approach, because a woman could say, well, this wasn't given to me. I'm a woman. This is a masculine pronoun. Well, no, you use common sense to extrapolate this out in every situation. This is for everybody. You shall not murder. God's the author of life. He's sovereign over it. You know, I like the translation murder because sometimes we misunderstand the translation kill. The Bible in the Old Testament offers, there are numerous places where life can be taken, but the Bible never sanctions murder. So this individual action of taking another person's life, God outlaws it in the Ten Commandments. Verse 14, no adultery. Marriage is the foundational human relationship. It's used by God to symbolize His relationship with His people. And so God mandates sexual purity. You honor God's foundational relationship. It is the purest of all and the holiest of all human bonds. Marriage is. That one flesh relationship is where human beings can engage in potentially procreation, and it's the one act where they engage in fully expressing the image of God, male and female together. And that is reserved for the bonds of marriage. Now, you'll find examples of polygamy in the Old Testament where men will have more than one wife. You will not find any examples of polyandry where women have more than one husband. That won't exist in the Old Testament. But what you'll discover is that the marriage between one man and one woman is always held in high esteem as God's original design. Jesus will refer to it himself when he's asked about marriage. He'll say, well, haven't you read that God created male and female, and the husband's will leave his wife and leave his parents and cleave into his wife, and they'll become one flesh. So this is the fullest expression of the image of God, because God evidently designed it that way. The only way to fully express His image was for there to be both genders, both male and female. And so when a male and a female come together in a marriage relationship, that's the fullest expression of the image of God. There's to be no stealing. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Well, stealing threatens the social order. Ownership is honored in the legislation of the Old Testament. So is stewardship. You're to keep your hands off of what's not yours. That's just how it works. It's a fundamental principle. You're to be a good steward of what you have, establishing your ownership of what you possess, and then no one else is to take it from you. Then, no false witness. Verse 16, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Now, there's that word neighbor. It's the first time it appears. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, the ancient world's justice system heavily used capital punishment for most offenses. Just about everything that someone did wrong in that ancient world was punishable by death. Okay? It's one of the ways in that society they maintained order. So consequently, if you bear false testimony against a neighbor, it can have drastic results. It can result in their death. And so God specifically forbids that kind of practice. You cannot give false testimony. Because y'all even remember, even in the New Testament time, if you can get two witnesses to something, well, then you have the truth, right? If they would just bear this out with each other. So in the ancient world, God is ruling this out to distinguish these people from others. Then he takes it one step further, where he says, not only shall you not steal, if you look at verse 17, you shall not even covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When you get to this command, God is taking the commandments to a whole nother level. And what he is basically saying is, you've got the word envy, at least in Hebrew, The word covet, rather, in Hebrew, verse 17, is the word for desire. That word is neutral. It has has nothing negative associated with it. Does that make sense? The word desire, covet, just means you have desires. But what this command is basically communicating is that you and I have to exercise restraint in managing our desires. We've got to come to a mature understanding of not everything we desire is good. And if we start desiring what belongs to someone else, then we have to stop the desire. Not only can we not engage in the behavior, we've got to stop the desire. We've got to manage it. And so we've got to have restraint in how we treat our neighbor. Now here's what's fascinating, because sometimes it can get really confusing when you're reading this next whole section of Exodus. Where is everybody? That's one of the questions when you read these stories. Where is Moses? Is Moses up on the mountain? Is Moses down the mountain? Is God speaking to the people? Is God speaking to Moses? It gets very confusing. I'll show that to y'all as we make our way through this, because sometimes we don't know. Evidently right now, everybody is at the foot of the mountain and God's talking to everybody. Okay? So this message is coming from God. So look at verse 18. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. So God's present on the mountain. They stayed at a distance and they said to Moses, "From now on, you tell us what he says." That's basically what they're telling him. You tell us. Let's don't have him talking to us. This scares us. We don't know what to do with this right here. Okay, so if it's okay, because here we're afraid if we get this close to God where he's talking to us, we will die, because we don't even know what we're doing yet. We're not even sure how to live out these commands. So Moses says to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." In other words, you ought to be afraid of him. You ought to have the appropriate reverence, if you will. So the people remained at a distance, and Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. So now Moses is going to make his way into the very presence of God. So these people respond with reverence and awe for their God. So here's basically what's happening, and we'll stop. God is not just giving a set of random laws that he thinks it might be a good idea if you keep them. That's not what's happening. God is speaking to these redeemed people who he has just rescued, and he is sharing with them his expectations of how he wants them to live as expressions of his divine nature, and he's calling them to live as his representatives among all the other peoples in the world. And the way they're going to distinguish themselves from the rest of the pagan people of the world is by obeying these moral imperatives. It will distinguish them from their neighbors, and it will be an expression of his divine will, and in some ways, a taste of heaven on earth. That's really the heart of the Ten Commandments. All right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that are online, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.